Cinder Boys to Cinemen, episode 3.
Enys Boys to Enys Men.
Not planned.
No,
not planned at all. That wasn't planned.
No, we didn't.
No, not at all.
We didn't.
Hope you're well, wherever you are. As one would have guessed from our short yet incredibly witty rebrand, we're going to be discussing Enys Men this week.
Yes.
A film from writer-director Mark Jenkin, once again returning to Cornwall on the cinema screen.
Ooh.
Moving away from Bait, which was sort of more of a socio-economic story of divide.
Class divide.
Yeah, class divide and the sort of demise of Cornish, I guess, history, identity and industry.
Yeah.
In the presence of
globalisation.
Holiday makers.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Well, yeah. Both were. And this time, however, he moves into a story more about Cornish folklore and mythology.
Yeah.
Chiefly through the horror genre, or the folk horror genre, which will also be an area of discussion as we talk about its resurgent popularity and a few of our favourite examples.
Yeah.
Sure to be a belter.
Questing the cinematic void.
So then, folk horror. A subgenre of sorts that has become incredibly popular over the last sort of 5 or so years.
Yeah.
Chiefly because of two filmmakers, you could argue.
Yeah, so.
Ari Aster and Robert Eggers.
Yeah.
And we'll go into a discussion about their films a bit later on. But I guess the question I want to put to you, Ben, is what is it about folk horror that has appealed to so many people, certainly over the last few years?
Okay, yeah, so you've got to think of films like Enys Men. So you've got Kill List, got A Field in England, Don't Look Now, The Lighthouse, Men, The Wicker Man, stuff like that. Just spitballing a few examples.
Okay, yeah, no, good.
But I think that a lot of these films have like an extraordinary sense of place, right? Sense of setting. So maybe more so with The Lighthouse and Men and The Wicker Man.
Okay.
But like folk horror always, to me, seeks sort of envelope its audience with its setting.
Okay.
I always find so it's usually a rural setting, kind of like untainted by the sort of clutter of civilization, but also an understanding that the natural world is a place filled with uncertainty and sort of danger.
Okay. Right.
Things that we perhaps don't understand and can't identify with anymore. So the setting is sort of burst with history,
right?
But not kind of crucially not with any kind of the kind of history that's well documented. So you get more a history of like superstition and like witchcraft and like religious fundamentalism, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's not like the Tudors, it's more like things that weren't written down.
Okay.
And I always find that like folk horror films sort of seem to anchor themselves to that side of history.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
So I always feel like that's sort of where a decent folk horror film gets its scares and its sort of foreboding atmosphere from. Like from like an undocumented time, or at least scientifically undocumented. So
yes, it
sort of kind of taps into your fear of the unknown, I guess. So it's like feeling I associate a lot with the Blair Witch Project.
Okay.
A kind of controversial choice, maybe, but...
Well, it's funny you should say that because you mentioned that before we started recording, that you always said it kind of tententatively as if I was going to sort of immediately shoot you down. I'm with you. I'm a fan of the film, so by all means.
Yeah, I mean, like aesthetically, Enys Men, or Enys Men, I should say, is a lot different, but the tone and the feeling I actually found to be quite similar, strangely. So,
okay.
I don't know, it's weird you can't really describe the feeling, so I'll just call it, it's like a witchy feeling, it's witchy. That's the only way I can describe it. It's unsettled.
Apt. It's certainly apt.
Witchy feeling. Partly, I think the resurgence of the genre is sort of down to economics, because you taught at film school to never shoot a film in the woods because it's sort of considered a cop out.
Okay,
I don't agree with that at all, but
yeah, it's like the same thing. It's like there's always that group of boys that wants to do a gangster film or something like that. Yeah,
but just in the local woods.
Yeah.
So,
or in their university halls room. Yeah.
But the reason why that sort of setting is so attractive is because it's cheaper, partially. Yeah. After films like The Witch and Kill List, I think the industry's realised that there's a section of audience kind of hungry for that sort of witchy feeling still.
Okay, yeah.
And actually, audiences still admire the respite that kind of comes with a rural setting. So it's simultaneously cheap, but it's also carries with it a sense of prestige. I feel like.
Yeah.
So yeah, like you say, we're seeing this more and more recently with films like Midsummer, Men, and The Lighthouse. They're all A24 releases, which is a studio kind of renowned for its focus on placing small bets on budding filmmakers. If they lose, they lose small, right? But if they win, they win big.
Yeah.
It's a great way to work.
Yeah.
I think that's probably. I think that's partially why it's it oiled its gears a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic response, actually.
A long response.
Great.
Apologies.
Yeah, no, great one. I really like the idea how aspects of mythology at least feel undocumented.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a big part of the success of these films, is that sort of attaching themselves to an era or a sense of place that we all feel in us. I think what I love so much about certainly more contemporary examples, indeed some of the older examples you mentioned there with Wicker Man, which I watched for the first time this week in preparation, so I'll give you my thoughts on that later.
Of course, yeah.
I think it's this idea of how mythology has sculpted the way in which we make sense of the world around us.
Okay, yeah.
In the sense that so much of these early civilizations and societies had a lot of things that they couldn't quite work out.
Yeah.
And mythology was a way of trying to understand these things.
Yeah.
And even though we have come a long way since then, that sense of mythology is still sort of residual. It's still there within us. And I think it still has a place in our society, not just in the formation of our rules or our anxieties, but sort of as a place of interest, which is also, I think, a reason why so many people are drawn to these films.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, folklore is the backbone behind stories still told to this day.
Yes.
Like, the Grimm Tales, which became Disney films, and they're everywhere, like it or not. Like, religious superstition sort of ignited, or it has historically ignited the sort of the fire of the kind of the tale, I guess. I don't know what the right word to describe it is. The campfire stories. I guess. Yeah. That's the right word. I think.
Yes, agreed. There's something comforting in that as well, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And I agree as well about that notion of there's something being more of an economic reasoning for it. I think this idea that they're perhaps a bit cheaper in some cases. I mean, I don't really have the budgets of the more recent examples to hand, but I think in terms of a studio like A24, who have now become very much a sort of darling of the sort of cinematic landscape, a lot of people see that logo and they get excited, and that's not happened for a long time for a sort of like another film company to come along, or film production company or distribution company to come along and sort of have a presence that almost upsets the balance of the mainstream studios.
And comparable to studios like Warner Brothers or Universal, the money they're putting in is almost nothing. It's about, I think The Lighthouse is about sort of 5 to 10 million.
Okay. Which in the modern landscape is chump change, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Literally next to, less than the catering budget for Fast and Furious, probably. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
got to feed your family.
I think it's really interesting what A24 have done recently, and they are. It's strange. Just when I was researching for this, I do my research.
Yes, evidently.
It's just that they kept cropping up, and funnily enough, I mean, Enys Men isn't from A24 at all, I don't think.
No.
But I think that company have really bolstered the resurgence of folk horror more so than any other company.
I think if it's not going to come from A24, it's going to be coming from companies that want to jump on that or ape that.
Yeah, Blumhouse or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess ape might have a negative connotation, and it's certainly the case of Enys Men. It's there's nothing negative about that, because it's very much a continuation of the genre's deserved sort of popularity in the modern time. Yeah. But I think you're right in terms of it's definitely initiated this trend. And I think, A24 in general, a lot of their popularity seems to have stemmed from horror films, hasn't it, really? I mean, a lot of their big hitters.
Oh, definitely.
I know they're sort of starting to fan out. I know they were involved, obviously, with Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah.
So obviously they're getting more confident, and as they rightly should. They're still making great decisions.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I just think it's an interesting sort of side note to mention them, and how they seem to have almost this sort of fanfare that seems to almost spread further than like real film fans. Like even people that aren't that into films know who A24 are. They will purposely go out and watch one of their films because they've got a sort of pedigree now, which I think is really fascinating, really interesting.
Definitely.
Let's talk about a couple of examples then.
Okay.
Where would you like to start then, Ben? You hit us with one. Come on.
All right, okay, go on. You're going to like this one. I want to talk about Kill List.
Oh.
I really want to talk about Kill List.
Yeah, okay.
So Ben Wheatley, 2010, doesn't dress itself up as a folk horror film. I mean, the DVD case does, but you start watching and you're like, this is like a family drama / hitman caper film.
Yeah.
And there are throughout it's peppered with like odd, really unsettling moments.
There's just like an off-kilter feel to the whole movie.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of testament to both Ben Wheatley and his partner, Amy Jump, is it? That she co-writes the script with him, or all of his scripts, I believe.
Yeah.
Just throughout, there's just this constant sense of unease, isn't there? Even, we spoke about this quite a while ago, but I think that despite the film being unrelentingly grim thematically and incredibly violent at points, sort of sickeningly so. One of the most excruciating parts in the film is that dinner sequence quite near the start.
Yes.
That sort of really sort of sets up the stall of the movie in terms of that sort of sense of unease you're going to feel, not just in violence or in theme, but in sort of general atmosphere.
Energy.
And energy,
which a lot of folk horror films rely wholly on.
Yeah.
That same energy. And it's so odd to have it come from like a modern dinner party setting. I think it's Essex or something. It's just so odd.
Is it?
Yeah. But it creeps up on you. The folk aspect of it really does kind of seep in unnoticed.
Yeah.
And by the time the ending happens, you're drowning it, and it's too late.
Yeah.
I love that film, and I'd love to talk about that more. Actually, that film.
What I love so much about the way the film utilises the folk horror elements, before we move on, actually, is just that it sort of just almost happens right near the end of the film. So you get this sense that it's always hidden away because it's almost like this group is sort of almost goading him into this position, isn't it, where they can do whatever they want with him. And that's throughout the narrative of the film, but it doesn't really sort of unleash that until right near the end. And I remember the first time I saw the film, I mean, I was fucking completely absorbed, because I think there's one thing certainly early Ben Wheatley can do is absorb you in the most fucking god-awful sort of corners of the human condition, and you are completely sucked in, and there's just, you can't get out, and a part of you wants to, but a big part of you doesn't want to, and then for all of a sudden, for these sort of spoilers, sort of people with these wicker face masks dancing around the fire to turn up out of nowhere, but it feels completely, it doesn't feel tacked on. It feels completely sort of necessary and essential to the narrative. Because of that sort of sense of unease, and because of that, the way that it's sort of almost sort of sprinkled throughout the narrative. Yeah,
like that moment when he's in that kind of motorway travel tavern type place, and there's the ex-girlfriend of Michael Smiley's. Is it Michael Smiley? Yeah, Michael Smiley. The ex-girlfriend of his character is just outside waving at him. What the fuck is that? And it and that's why it doesn't feel tacked on. I find it's just moments like that are just like, okay, brilliant. I mean, I adore early Ben Wheatley a great deal, and I really hope there's a return to form for him. Really, because he's for a long time he was one of my favourite filmmakers this side of the pond. I felt. But we all have our duds, don't we? And I'm sure he'll come back. I'd be interested to know what people think about some of his newer films. Maybe another podcast another time. Yeah, definitely. I want to talk about The Witch, if I may. Please do. The Witch for... That's enough. No, go on. The Witch is the defining example of a film that sort of explores how powerful mythology and folklore is, not just in shaping people's understanding of their immediate environment, but also as a tool of control. Okay, yeah. So obviously this is set in, is it New England or that sort of area and era? Undocumented New England time. Where homesteaders sort of. Yes. People who obviously wanted to flee what they perceived was this sort of oppressive rule set in mainland Europe, fled to this newfound land to create their own society and their own rules. Yeah. And there's this family
spearheaded by the patriarch, who is devoutly religious, almost too devoutly religious, even for the community that he lives in.
Yeah.
So this, because at the start of the film, they're sort of sent off, aren't they? They're removed from the community. Yeah, outcast. That's the word. And they go and start a new life on a fledgling farm on the border of a very sort of unnerving patch of woodland.
Yeah.
And what I love so much about the film is how it taps into how folklore was used as a method to control not just the behaviour of everybody, but with an especial focus on women.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
The idea that there's this sort of pursuit of purity that seems to be more placed on the shoulders of women than men. Women aren't sort of allowed to sort of entertain desire, for example, be that sexual or any sort of any other aspiration.
Yeah, no, even just general enjoyment.
Yeah, it seems that these sort of parameters, and you sort of talked about that before in your introductions to why you thought these films are so popular. It's the way it sort of fuses mythology with religion, and almost like they're one and the same.
Yeah,
both sort of methods of control. Even though people are terrified of what's in the wood and witches and all of this stuff, it's not far removed from the religious sort of doctrines that are supposed to keep these people on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I mean, it's all because they deal with the same subject, which is the unknown.
Yeah,
and they're both about people not knowing stuff. That's why these things exist. Yeah, and so that's why those two things, mythology and religion, go hand in hand, I feel. And yeah, I mean, it sort of brings me to a thought. I remember reading a book. Oh yeah, pretty highbrow. An audio book.
Yeah. And it was about this idea of moral panics, and it had a section where it focused on the witch craze in Europe during the medieval times.
Okay,
but I feel like, I mean, with absolutely no sort of expertise or knowledge on the subject to any degree, I feel like it is somewhat comparable to the witch craze in New England. Basically, the authors of this book theorised that the rising popularity of sort of like fear of witches and the resulting crimes, which are often burnings, hangings, basically murder, with very little basis of evidence, as you'd expect, as witches obviously aren't real. The idea behind this theory was that it was a way of almost pushing women back down.
Okay,
as women were sort of, their role in the family was becoming perhaps more prominent than the powers that be, being, the patriarchal religious society wanted them to be. So this idea that demonising women and creating this idea that any woman could be a witch, any woman was capable of great evil, and it creates this sort of religious fervour that sort of justifies the sort of large-scale murder of many women. It's just an interesting side thought I thought was interesting to explore, because I think it links quite nicely into the ideas of this film, in the sense about the idea of oppressing freedoms in this pursuit of, this ultimately fruitless pursuit of perfection. Yeah. And what does that sort of, what are the parameters of perfection? Who are they decided by? By religion. Yeah. Which in itself, as we said, is the pursuit of the unknown.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, that, because I mean, you kind of link that to Salem witch trials as well, which is much more of an American reaction to witchcraft, and it's just the acts of violence that occurred, mainly hangings, were just so senseless and so unthinkably, unspeakably violent, and that's carried, that kind of echoed through history to the point where it's such a horrible but fantastic thing to make a horror film about. Yeah. Which is just, and that's why I think it elevates, just off the top of my head, like Scream 3 or something. Not a folk horror film. No. And then you've got something like, I mean, it's unfair to compare the two, but you've got something like Midsummer or like A Field in England, and it's just, the sort of, the themes are so potent, and that definitely derives from historical occurrences like Salem witch trials and the witch craze in Europe as well, definitely.
And I think it speaks as well to a still contemporary notion that it is always worthwhile being sceptical of these belief systems, in terms of trying to understand what exactly it is, who seems to gain the most out of these sort of decisions and these sort of long-standing instructions that seem to be bestowed upon a group of individuals and followed in some cases to the absolute letter.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I don't know. I just think that's a great one of the best. I think that's for me when I really stood up and took notice of folk horror.
Oh, really?
Was with that film, yeah.
Yeah, with the witch.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it was something that maybe just sort of putting the genre to a film and thinking, oh, okay.
Yeah, this is why people find this scary.
Yeah, this is why it's here. Because it is a film of pretty grim moments, but I think it's that sort of use of theme and history and silence and quiet. You know, there's no sense of wanting to sort of please the audience through the expectations that have long been cultivated in the horror genre. You know, for violence or, you know, and I'm not saying that that's
the revelation of a monster or something like that. Yeah, I'm
not saying that with negativity, by the way. Like, I fucking love like slasher films, all that kind of stuff. But I think if you want films that have got a bit more, I guess, thematic richness to them, without sounding like a twat, I think folk horror's really sort of achieved that. And I think Eggers is someone that has, through his sort of stringent research, meticulous attention to detail, and brilliant direction, and of course the fantastic performances in that film, and Anna Taylor-Joy, isn't it? She's fantastic.
Yeah, and also
achieves it.
Yeah, Finchy as well from The Office.
I
can't remember the actor's name. He's a great actor. Ralph Ineson, I think.
Yes, I think that might be
Rafe Ineson. I can't remember. Yeah,
he's one of those actors sort of like just pops in and out, but he's always so impactful every time, and he gets quite a sizable role here, which is deserved. He's excellent.
Funny that just before we move on, the witch, one of the scenes that really sticks out in my head, like you say, is a scene of silence. They're just around a dinner table, not talking to each other, and that is one of the key moments for me, because I haven't seen that in a long time, a good few years, but I just remember that so vividly, that horrible atmosphere, and it was all just them sitting around a table not talking to each other, and you know, it's lit by candles, and that's all you need, really.
Yeah, I mean, the last time I saw that film, I was on holiday in Wales, and we were in an Airbnb in a house in Wales, and it was the worst weather I've ever had on a holiday. But it was awesome, because it just felt like it was like the really brutal winds and rain, and we were sat with a fire watching this film. And I don't know, there's something like being in Wales as well. It's like Wales and Cornwall, which is obviously the setting of Enys Men.
Yes.
These places always, I guess it's because they're steeped in that sort of Celtic history.
Yeah.
And they're far removed from the places that we call home in England, that, I don't know, it does feel out in the sticks.
Big time. And their mythology hasn't turned into religion either. No. It's just mythology. It's just folklore. It's kind of, it's all lost to time.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, with somewhere more mainland, I would say mainland, but like somewhere, you know, more central England, you've got a lot more churches and stuff.
Yeah.
And the folklore has morphed into something which people are really familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, religion, I guess, in some ways, is almost sort of dominated or almost sort of amalgamated with folklore in many cases. And that's certainly the case with The Witch.
Perfect.
Good. Another film then. I've had my shot. It's your turn.
All right then. Another Eggers movie, Lighthouse.
Yes.
Bloody love it.
Fantastic.
I'd say aesthetically, probably the closest to Enys Men.
Yeah.
It's just, it doubles down on that atmospheric, that witchiness almost. The story is so abstract and so almost second nature that you sort of descend into madness with these two men, based on a horrible story, real story that happened. Two lighthouse keepers, one of them died. He didn't want to have a rotting corpse in the lighthouse, so he put a coffin outside the lighthouse, and there was a storm and it fell out, and the hand smashed a window or something. Robert Eggers based the screenplay for The Lighthouse just on this sort of fisherman's tale. Okay. It's crazy, man, really. But he kind of adapted the feeling that story gives you, I feel.
Yeah.
And then there's some mermaid stuff as well. I don't know about that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I love so much about that is the mythology there is nautical.
Yes.
Which again ties very much into what we are going to discuss later with Enys Men.
Yeah.
And it's about this idea, I think, of like the mythology is in with the sort of attempts to understand again, the unknown with the ocean,
Yeah.
and the failed attempts to try and control or dominate it.
Yes.
I mean, because the lighthouse itself represents this sort of attempt to sort of control the sea, doesn't it? I mean, people and boats. For those who don't know how a lighthouse works, I don't know why I'm even going to bother, but I'm going to say it anyway. It signals, boats in, and it's almost this way of saying, that you're not at the sea's mercy, you're at the mercy of mankind, the ingenuity of mankind over the sort of power of the sea, power of nature.
But I mean, in this case, it proves fruitless.
Yeah.
Nature wins 100%.
Yeah.
From the lighthouse, and it's a lesson that they both learn, and perhaps take on a little bit earlier with like Willem Dafoe's obsession with the light itself.
Yeah, there's almost some sort of like godlike being.
Yeah, it's almost like mankind has created this light, and the light has been deified.
Yeah,
and he's just in awe of it.
Yeah,
of this kind of false control they think they have over this rock.
Yeah,
and the kind of ocean around it. Definitely. Out of all folk horror I can think of at the moment, probably the most similar to Enys Men.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Mm.
and another great example. I mean, Eggers is just, for me, I think he's the master's a word that people throw around quite a lot, but I think in terms of the evidence before me, he is just someone that knows how to bleed mythology into his stories, and I think it comes from this just sort of ridiculously meticulous amount of research he does in his work.
Yeah.
If you read like his scripts, he even, I think at the start of the Witch script, if I'd recommend anyone read it, but it's details how meticulous this sort of research was in terms of the dialect and the mythology that sort of dictated the lives of these individuals.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and I think that really shows in his work a great deal.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
I think if you're going to do period pieces, he's the guy you should fucking look to, because he's the guy that should inspire you just to go that bit deeper, because it will only help your film thematically.
Nice. Good choice.
Yeah, it's almost become the Robert Eggers Appreciation podcast.
I just realised it was my choice as well. Good choice, Ben. Yeah, brilliant.
What about his sort of his production company co-owner? Because they've gone into a company together, I believe, Ari Aster and Robert Eggers.
Have they?
I think they have got a production company together, yes.
Okay.
And talk about Midsummer. Because Midsummer is interesting to me because it's the first film we've discussed and one of the first big folk horror films of the last few years to move away from English or Cornish or Welsh folklore and into that of another land, and almost through the eyes of a Westerner.
Yeah.
And how we almost it's almost like observing another species.
Yeah.
And almost looking at it with like almost amusement.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because that whole group goes there. I mean, they get invited by one of the Swede. They're
Swedish. Yeah, Swedish housemate, isn't it?
But they're like tourists in this sort of increasingly bizarre scenario, but they go there like sort of to gawp at them, really.
Yeah, because a couple of them are doing a study in sort of local folklore.
Yeah,
aren't
sort
they?
of thinly veiled as a kind of college trip / thesis.
Yeah.
Kind of field studies, really weird, but great. I love Midsummer, and again, it has that atmosphere. It has that just tense, witchy atmosphere, which is odd because it's all in the day. Fucking fair play to them. I don't know how they manage that.
Just to generate so much tension and fear in daylight is a real achievement, given that horror films tap into that very sort of early human race anxiety around nighttime and the dangers that brings. Another thing I'd like to say about that film as well is, and I guess it ties into Enys Men in the sense that it's that fusion of history and mythology with personal trauma, personal memories.
Yes.
Throughout the film, Florence Pugh's character is obviously dealing with a breakup, what eventually becomes a breakup.
Yep.
The suicide of her parents.
Yeah.
So these are things that are very, very raw and almost brutally sort of applied throughout the entirety of the film.
Slowly.
And it's the way he fuses those things together. He fuses, and it's almost like humanizing that mythology even more.
Yeah.
And suggesting its relevance still, no matter how silly it might look to us now, you know?
Yeah, it's I totally agree with you. I think that he saw something in the idea of grieving and going through a kind of personal trauma, like something like a breakup, and he saw similarities between that feeling and the feeling of uncertainty and unknown, which comes with cult behavior, basically. Yeah. All these characters are just totally unprepared for just how extreme the behavior of other cultures can be sometimes. And the marriage of those themes is really genius and isn't easy, presumably. So fair play.
Yeah, indeed. Great film. Another great one. A very divisive one, though. I'd say more divisive than the other examples we've discussed.
Yeah.
It seems to be that film for me that whenever I mention it, like half the people go brilliant and the other half people go fucking shit.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I always find really annoying, but that's just because I enjoyed the film so much. Obviously, people are entitled to think it's shit.
Of course.
But
I can understand.
the pacing.
Yeah, it is quite slow, and like we said before, it's unconventional in its use of lighting, because it's all in bright sunlight. I think you have to like films like The Wicker Man, and you have to have a kind of basic knowledge of films that came before it, because especially with that ending, like it's pretty much it's a Wicker Man ending, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I can say that now because I've seen The Wicker Man. I agree. I think there's something about the horror genre. I think it is the genre alongside, superhero films, for example. It's the genre that you sort of know what to expect from it, because there are so many films, found footage films. I know they've sort of been and gone a little bit, but there are so many films that just have the exact same beats, the exact same devices, in which they sort of scare their audience. And I think a lot of that just comes down to familiarity.
Yeah.
And that sense of, actually, yes, I know what's going to happen in this horror film. And that's fine.
Yeah.
and that's entertaining, which I completely get with. That's fine. I'm not slagging that off, but I think where Midsommar comes in is that it's a film. It's a film concerned as much with theme as it is with shock.
Yeah.
Or anything, any of the other things you would more commonly associate with more sort of run-of-the-mill horror films that tend to sort of be almost a constant in the sort of mainstream cinematic release schedule.
The whole film is the scare, really.
Yeah,
like, that's kind of it. Like, and again, that's the same with a lot of folk horror. It's the entirety of the atmosphere. It's not kind of sharpened to a point, and it doesn't all come to a head. It's like you're in it for 2 hours.
Yeah,
and you either appreciate it or you just don't care because you're waiting for something to jump out at you, which is also fine. But personally, I love that. I love that dread. That feeling of dread. I don't know why.
Yeah, I think it's those kinds of horror films that stick with you more. Midsommar was a horror film that stayed with me for a long time.
Yeah.
More so than half the horror films that I've watched in recent memory. Or certainly around that time. And don't get me wrong, I love the genre. I love slashers. I love all that kind of stuff. But I certainly feel like more modern horror films have certainly found their audience, and that audience, I don't want to say as a sort of broad generalized statement that would probably be unfair and untrue, but they seem to be the people that dislike Midsommar the most.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Anyway, before we move on to Enys Men, we're supposed to discuss Enys Men, I think would be amiss to not talk about Wicker Man.
Okay, fair enough.
Which I would argue is the sort of subgenre, as folk horror is, I think, a subgenre.
Yeah.
It's the subgenre blueprint.
Yeah, it's like it's like 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's what that film is to science fiction. It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree. And I think what I find so interesting about that film is about the theistic conflict in that film between the organised religion of Christianity. So you've got the detective it's Sergeant Howie, isn't it? The detective, I think his name.
Edward Woodward. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
A devout Christian coming into one of the small last sort of vestiges of paganism.
Yes.
And that sort of conflict playing out between him and them.
Yeah.
And how ultimately that sort of moral outrage and disgust that he frequently espouses is manipulated against him in the film.
Yeah, definitely. There's quite a lot. I haven't seen it in a while, but I remember overwhelmingly feeling like a very strong theme in the film was the sense of being outnumbered.
Okay.
He is like you say, he's a man of really strong morals, and he kind of arrives there with the view to control, and he's just overwhelmed by, like you said, this kind of pagan cult, and they attempt to, at the beginning, they kind of attempt to ease him into it, don't they, with like folk songs, and that bit where she's like smacking the wall, singing that really,
trying to sort of beckon him in with her siren song.
Yeah, and then you got the kind of the scene, which the iconic ending really of the burning of the Wicker Man. Spoilers. The burning it's from the 70s. The burning of the Wicker Man itself, which is just a really unexpected and really striking image, and is probably the reason why a lot of other folk horror films use fire as a motif. I mean, like we were discussing Midsummer, it's just the same, isn't it? And because I think fire is obviously associated with the devil.
Could you say it's maybe sort of anchored in our sort of primal past as well?
Yeah, definitely.
I would say about the film, and I sort of felt a bit stupid afterwards, but the sort of unease of the film didn't really become obvious to me till the credits were rolling.
Okay.
The way that the sort of film deploys that folk music, or the sort of the pagan imagery throughout. Obviously, it's sort of unnerving, but it only becomes really apparent when you realise that he's obviously being manipulated to be the guy that burns in the Wicker Man. It only became apparent then, and it all sort of slots into place, and you realise how uneasy the whole thing makes you feel.
Yeah, and he's never in control at all. He's
which
always
is
at the mercy.
Something he would used to be, being a representative of the law of the land, and a land of which is Christian, where you are overwhelmingly the most dominant religion. He's
respected, presumably as an authority figure.
Yeah,
and then he just gets plonked in this
Wicker fella.
Just
burnt. Yeah. Great, I love it. And the ending was particularly impactful, I thought. Brilliant ending.
Good stuff.
Good. We would be amiss not to talk about Wicker Man for sure. Right, Enys Men then.
Enys Men.
Sort of touched on it in the intro. It's a world away from his previous film, isn't it? I mean, Bate certainly has elements of exploration of sort of mythology and folklore.
Yeah.
But it's certainly far more prominent here, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh my god, yeah, it's at the forefront.
Even more so than perhaps narrative coherency is.
Yeah, yeah. I actually think I don't think that's for me. That wasn't a weakness, but I could see why some people think it might be. I thought it was a really bold move by Mark Jenkins
I think so.
To just kind of say, I'm not doing another Bait. I'm not going to even touch on what's going on with Cornwall anymore. I've said what I need to say about that. I just want to tell this story. It's in my head, and it's very much in his head by the looks of things. Like there's not a thread to follow at all. It's witchy though. It's bloody witchy, mate.
Yes.
I was ready to be enveloped by that as well when I went to see it. I was in a kind of good place for it. I don't know if you ever stood in the middle of a really sparse moorland, like proper Wuthering Heights territory.
Okay, yeah.
It's really isolating. You sort of feel really helpless and lonely because there's nothing for sound to bounce off. And you have no influence over your surroundings all of a sudden. So you can't mute the sound of the wind or the waves, can you? So it almost feels like the environment's having more of an influence over you all of a sudden. That's what I would describe watching Enys Men. Agreed. It's just that feeling in film form.
I completely agree, and I think it speaks a lot to Jenkins' use of sound and music. It's almost such a sort of analog audio bombardment. I mean, the whole film is like an analog bombardment because Jenkins famously, I think famously is the right word, hand cranks all of his own footage and cuts it all himself and makes all of the music himself.
Yes, he does. He's a bit of a one-man band in that respect.
I mean, unbelievable.
He has great, he's very open to collaboration, I think, but he does like to have that control, doesn't he? And it shines, I think, in this. Yeah,
it's a singular vision from a director that wants to convey this story of, Cornish mythology, Cornish history, but interweaving it into a very personal story of memory specifically trauma around that memory. The trauma within memories, or the memories of trauma. Sorry, and I think the way he fuses those things together, it suggests this sort of strength of bond between the people that are born and raised in a place and the place itself.
Okay.
And the history of that place.
You know? And how you can kind of bump into the history. Yeah,
it's so deep rooted in us in ways that we perhaps don't acknowledge.
Yeah.
I think it's almost quite, when you're, it's just going a bit off piece, but when you're sort of young and you almost espouse a disliking for where you're from. It's almost like a natural part of you to sort of go, this is shit.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I want to go somewhere else and experience something else. But as you get older, I think that sense of place within you becomes more apparent.
Yeah.
And you feel that sort of longing to be around it. And when you return to it, it's like nothing else.
It's funny because it's not explicitly stated that she is from there.
No.
But you kind of, there's sort of, I don't know if I can call them flashbacks, but it's her younger self who I feel like she bumps into.
Yeah.
So she there's a kind of an event involving her falling off a roof.
Yeah.
Which leads her to have this scar.
Mm-hmm.
Reminded me what happens with that scar. I guess we could sort of just say spoilers for this film as well.
Yeah.
When that lichen starts to grow out of it.
Yeah.
That kind of is just a perfect illustration of what you were saying and what I was saying earlier about folk horror is when that lichen starts to grow on her. I did sort of think it was a kind of like a metaphor for the landscape in swallowing her back up.
Yeah.
And she's sort of returning to her roots against her will a little bit. Yeah. It reminded me of the fountain as well. Do you remember that bit in the fountain when all those flowers grow out of him?
Oh,
I don't know why. It just reminded me a little bit of that.
Underrated Aronofsky.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think because of her succumbing to this sort of sparse, isolating landscape, that's why you get that lichen growing on her. Maybe that's just my interpretation. This is very much open to interpretation. I feel
absolutely. I think the way that Jenkin almost does away with narrative in a coherent sense. Of course, there is a somewhat slight narrative strand going through it in terms of the use of quote-unquote flashbacks.
Yeah, a lot of repetition as well.
Repetition, yes, exactly. Just what you took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, the use of repetition in terms of the mundanity of routine almost, and how sort of nightmarish and how sort of uneasy that can make you feel.
Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I feel like the narrative, this might be a bit of a plain way of interpreting it, but she is just going insane. As the days start to blend together, the past starts to blend with that. And I don't know. I think that's totally fine just to have a film about a woman going insane on an island and losing her grip on reality as the very, very tedious and banal task of looking after these flowers starts to become. And her rituals start to change as history catches up to her a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing I find really sort of chilling about it is just the act of isolating oneself.
Okay.
I don't know if that's something that it's certainly not universal, because I think a lot of people like to sequester themselves into sort of hidden parts of the world, the last sort of hidden parts of the world. But I don't know, I feel like tales of isolation seem to be more impactful in terms of generating a sense of unease or some of the feelings that come with that sort of folk horror tag.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's why this film could definitely be labelled a folk horror, is mainly because of this very brutal, unrelenting atmosphere it sort of generates. So in tandem with isolation and big witchiness, I think like we already discussed, has a tremendous sense of history, or maybe past, present, and future existing as one. Which I actually sort of found was the only similarity between this and his previous film Bait. So it is tradition and progress at odds with each other, really. They're kind of bumping into each other. And because the volunteer's being consumed by this landscape, she's also being consumed by its history. Cornwall's got a really long history of mining, doesn't it? So she's constantly unearthing artefacts left over from that period. So you got that rusty machinery, but then she also finds the operators of that machinery. And they've left their imprint on this landscape. It's really psychologically frightening. I don't know why those miners scared me so much.
Yeah,
they were just a really. They're not malignant, but their very presence is just odd and very unusual. There's a stone as well, the standing stone.
Yes, sort of key, almost characterised by the sort of use of sound and
quite difficult to date apparently. These stones.
Oh,
I
really?
looked into a little bit. Like they're really difficult to place in terms of when they were put there.
Right.
I guess. What a wonderful way to reinforce this dark, uncontextualizable feeling.
Yeah.
So there's a point where the stone disappears, and I sort of thought that was meant to signify that she's arrived at a time before the stone existed.
Oh, so she's almost time travelled.
Yeah, it's a weird way to describe it, the time travel thing. But it's
sorry,
true.
Yeah,
you're
no,
totally right. Yeah.
I like that. I've not considered that idea at all.
Yeah,
even though the film is sort of rooted in these various moments in which humankind has, like you said, shaped the landscape, and those sort of scars on the landscape are still present, or the artifacts that they leave. Yeah. Are still there. I like that.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
And then in the same way that the scars that she's got, kind of. Oh yeah,
yeah. Got sort of like a David Brent sort of finger joint moment there.
Yeah. Oh my god, I've just discovered what Enys Men means about Enys Men. I keep saying Enys Men. Apparently it's Enys Men, which is actually Cornish for executive decision. No. It's Cornish for Stone Island.
I just imagine the whole film, but with Steven Seagal.
Yeah, I mean that's the only thing I really didn't like about it. The lack of Seagal.
Lack of Seagal. Yeah. Jenkin and him were in talks, but it just couldn't. Yeah, it wouldn't work out.
But it's funny, like you're invited to project meaning onto the stone. I think yourself as an audience member.
I think so. I think that idea of injecting meaning is something you can sort of take not just from the stone, but the whole film. I think when you have a narrative like that, we talked about this earlier, one of our earlier podcasts about, I think it was Alien, this idea of ambiguity and how ambiguity in cinema is sort of a lost art. Yeah. And one of the great strengths of it is that it allows more space for the viewer to imprint their own experiences and aspects of themselves onto the film. And thus, I think, create a stronger relationship and a relationship that will perhaps be more impactful in terms of how you've what aspects of yourself have you imparted onto the film, and how that's helped you to sort of come to better conclusions about not just the film but yourself. Without sounding too wanky or
no, I agree. I think it's funny because I feel like almost everyone in England has a memory of like a stone artifact like that, because you go on holiday, they're sort of everywhere.
Especially in Cornwall, which is like the go-to place for so many English holiday makers, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Yeah, and so everyone will have a memory of looking at something like that and just thinking, what the fuck is that? In this film, it looked a little bit like a statue of a woman, I thought, like with a big skirt. I don't know why, but that might have just been my imprint on it. A bit of a strange imprint, admittedly, but
sort of like some bizarre sort of Rorschach test.
Yeah.
The whole film is like a Rorschach test, basically, like a sort of coloured sort of auditory bombardment in auditory bombardment form. Yeah, no, I like that a lot. A great deal.
I thought Mark Jenkins' use of 16mm, the hand crank camera.
Yeah.
Didn't know that until recently. I knew it was 16mm, didn't know it was fucking hand cranked.
That's incredible. What a fucking labour of love that is,
Jesus Christ. Yeah, I actually thought it felt more at home in Enys Men than it did in Bait. Do you know why? I don't know why. I love Bait a lot. I think it's fantastic, but it leans into that experimental visual style that can be quite off-putting for some people. I didn't mind it at all. I want to kind of make that clear, but I feel like it did pretend, like, because the themes are so universal, it might have perhaps intentionally held it back from a bit more of a broader audience, although it did do tremendously well in that respect.
It continues to do tremendously well. It's opening up in new cinemas, isn't it?
Is it? Oh man, there you go. I eat my words. But no, I thought it was employed better in Enys Men. I don't know why. I just thought like the kind of graininess of it
It suited a film with less dialogue, perhaps.
Yeah.
I know that the attempt at the dialogue in his films is there's almost a distance to the sound recording of dialogue, which I think is tremendously effective in both films.
Yeah, I just think, like, in terms of if you're going to use a visual language like that, having like a folk horror film at the centre is just marvellous, because it just looks grainy, it looks dirty, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's got such a texture to it.
Yeah.
The visuals have kind of been marred by the setting and the landscape, and it's so it's like a really weathered looking film, and it plonks you right in the thick of the island. With that in mind, I just thought it was really well suited.
There's like a triple history then. It's like the history of the landscape, the history of the character, and the history of the medium.
Yeah.
All running parallel to one another.
Bloody hell. Didn't think of it like that.
Ooh.
Another Brent moment there.
Yeah. I think what I loved about the film, because I really enjoyed it as well, it's funny when the sort of credits rolled and everyone stood up, quite a lot of people audibly revealed their displeasure with the film.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of the film. I think maybe that says more about expectation, in terms of maybe people going in expecting more something like Bait. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because Bait is definitely experimental in lots of ways, but there is a narrative there that is perhaps a little bit easier to grab hold of.
Yeah, and like I say, it's more universal. Bait had more of a grasp on current affairs.
Yeah.
You know, like this in the whole kind of Cornish second home
stuff. Yeah, and the way that's having detrimental impact on the people that have spent their whole lives and their whole histories and lineages and families of living there. I mean, it's crazy how that's allowed to materialise.
Yeah, whereas Bait was a critical look at that. Enys Men isn't really critical of anything, and maybe people were expecting something more socially conscious. I think it would have been weird if a kind of folk horror film about one woman being on an island was somehow critical of the current time, I guess.
Yeah.
That would have been odd, but yeah, like you say, I agree. It's funny you mention that, actually, because there was a few people I remember hearing when I left the cinema. We went to see it separately, and there was a lot of people that didn't like it. Or at least initially thought, had quite a lot of negative stuff to say. Just basically, like, what the fuck was that film about? Like that was kind of their initial reaction.
But I think that's the sort of the game you play when you make a film like this. Like, some people are going to really get on with it, and people aren't. I mean, I know that sounds like a sort of vague and basic thing to say, but if you're making a film that is narratively vague, structurally more akin to like an art house film experience, then you are going to alienate people who aren't necessarily as either well versed or as interested in that kind of experience. But I think for people that are willing to settle into its rhythm, it will reward you deeply. And I think I like the idea of you saying that the film shies away from these grand statements. I think it replaces that with something that is deeply personal. Clearly personal to Jenkin, in the sense that it's about Cornish history and mythology, but also about the character's own traumas and memories. And I think in a way that feels deeply affecting, even though you're given scraps in which to sort of construct this history of this individual. It's more than enough to leave a powerful impression. Certainly on me. I mean,
definitely. I thought about it. I've been thinking about it for quite a while. It's got a good soundtrack. I say soundtrack, it's a score really by Jenkin, I guess. And that really aids the tone as well. Like a lot of folk horror has a really good, really unnerving soundtrack. If I were to criticise it, the sound design was a bit loud. I don't know if this might be in the cinema that I went into. Did you find that?
I remember thinking that the use of the soundtrack was incredibly loud. Because I know folk horror is generally, I mean, obviously the use of the score in any film is to dictate mood and tempo, but particularly here. But I wondered if that was a deliberate choice. I don't know if that's more to do with the sound system in the cinema I watched it in. But I prefer to think of it as like a deliberate choice. If it's going to bombard you, then it better do it properly. And I think
that radio is fucking loud.
Yeah.
My God.
Yeah. That was perhaps the most sort of
rousing.
Yeah.
Another thing. This is a very personal gripe, and it's probably intentional because of, like you mentioned before, the way he constructs his films is very, very analog. It's got lens dirt all over it, man. There's like he's clear. Obviously, you've seen on-set photos that it's a crew of like 4 or 5 just out in the sticks filming this thing, and it's very, very commendable. But there's these annoying dark blurry circles, and in my line of work, it's I'm sort of trained to look for them and remove them basically.
Yeah.
And they were all there, and it was just odd seeing those at the cinema, like in a finished product of something which otherwise was really, really polished. It personally annoyed me, and probably 0.01% of all other people that watched it as well. I don't know why.
To me, I just thought it was all part of that, tied into the sort of whole film stock grain aesthetic to me. So to me, it didn't even cross my mind.
It's probably, it might well be a rule of his that he doesn't do any visual effects shots other than maybe painting out a pylon or something.
I'd be interested to know if there was a lot of that done in post.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if there was, it was very good because I didn't notice anything apart from that one shot where she kind of gets flung backwards by the stone. Do you remember which I'm talking about?
Yeah.
That was a VFX shot. But apart from that, I can't think of one. Maybe they probably had to paint the stone out when the stone was gone. But yeah, it was probably entirely intentional. It was probably like on almost a Dogma 95-esque rule he imposed on himself. Just like, right, I'm processing this and I'm cutting it into my film, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that would be very much in the spirit of Jenkin, I think. So
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it annoyed me, but who am I to? I haven't made a film, so.
No, well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's good that you bring those sort of things to the table. There's sort of there's little niggles, because I think we pretty much wax lyrical about most of the films that we've discussed, or the episodes that we plan to discuss a film. So it's nice to have those little conversation points.
Strange annoyance, bugbears of mine. But there you go.
I think what I sort of enjoyed most about the film is that treatment of memory.
Okay.
I think the mythological element is obviously crucial to the film, and that's also something I enjoy because I'm fascinated by folklore. I really am, and I think that part of the reason for that fascination is because of its resurgence, as we've discussed earlier. But I think the way memories are treated as these sort of fractious, fleeting moment, intensely presented moments that just flash into your mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that really stuck out for me, is that whenever I think about something that's really embarrassing for me, or something that I'm really not proud of, or even a happy memory, like it's intense. Yeah. Intense in the way your brain presents it. It's like a flash, and then you sort of make a decision then whether you want that memory to sort of stay rent-free in your head, or you drive it back into the deepest, darkest parts of your mind. And I just think the way the film presented that to me was one of my absolute favourite things about it.
Oh, really? Okay. That's funny you said that, because the memory thing wasn't... I didn't get that from the film as much. I can understand where you're coming from, particularly with the younger version of herself. I think it's the younger version of herself in it.
It's funny, because initially I assumed it was like a daughter.
Yes, me too.
Until she falls through the spoiler,
the
sort of the roof, and then resulting in a wound that is.
Yeah, but I think the prevailing,
identical.
the prevailing theme for me was just the isolation and the landscape swallowing someone up. That's what I got from it. So it's funny that you got something almost entirely different. Although I can kind of understand where you're coming from with that.
Yes,
with that theme being brought to the forefront. I was maybe just in a different headspace. I was maybe.
Well, we all are, and that's again we talk about the idea of ambiguity allowing us to, put our impressions on the film, and there's the perfect example. Two very different readings of it.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, the ambiguity was when we talked about After Sun, wasn't it? It was about.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
How that can be employed well or badly, and it was employed well in this one as well. I think just a really good use of a lack of narrative, and that could have gone really badly wrong. I think the runtime helps as well. If this was 2 hours, I think I might have started to come back to earth a little bit.
Okay,
but it was a really good length as well. It was a nice succinct hour and a half.
Yeah,
and it said what it needed to say, it left you looking at the island at the end, and that was it.
Yeah, I think you're right about length. I mean, don't be wrong. If a film, I like a good long film, but that you can't underestimate the quality or the power, of a good quality 90-minute film.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
No, excellent film.
Yeah, really.
I really, really, really loved it. I'm really intrigued to see where he goes next.
Yeah, where can he go from here? Because I mean, he's done Bait, which was very popular and very successful. He's done Enys Men, which is almost like a sophomore effort, a lot more experimental in terms of narrative anyway. A lot less accessible, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that, yeah.
I mean, it's presumably going to be set in Cornwall again.
I wonder if... I was thinking that, like, I think even during the film, I don't know, I remember having to sort of say to myself, no, think about this afterwards, but, like, where do you go after that? Do you stay in the area you know and love so well, or do you expand yourself further afield, and what will be the impact of that?
Yeah.
I'd be really fascinated to see where he goes. I mean, regardless of what he does, I will follow keenly, and will watch, obviously. But I'd be really intrigued to see where he goes next.
Same.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Good stuff.
Leave it there.
Leave it there.
Questing the cinematic void.
So there we go then, another outro. Thanks for making it this far. We very much appreciate it, as always.
Thank you.
Very much enjoyed that discussion. It was nice to talk about another great film, but also a film that I would say we've got a bit of a personal connection to, haven't we? On the basis of the fact we both studied at Falmouth, which is in Cornwall, a place that's very special to both of our hearts. Obviously, we're not locals, but it was a place that took us in and looked after us very well for 3 years.
Yeah, wonderful 3 years spent there.
And also, I guess maybe you more than me, but a sort of relationship with the director as well.
So he was also a lecturer at Falmouth as well. So we both kind of...
Makes it feel sort of, I don't know, special in a way. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I didn't really speak to him very often, but I don't know,
same.
just knowing that, I don't know. There's something nice about that.
No, that is good. It's I feel bizarrely proud.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
He doesn't need it. He doesn't need our pride, but yeah.
So our dear friend Lee told me about Bait, and I was like, what? Mark Jenkins directed a film?
Yeah. It crept up with us, didn't it?
Yeah,
which is kind of a bit embarrassing to admit, being that we're film students and from Falmouth University.
Another dear friend of ours, Alfie, has a film that he's making at the moment, and he wants to put on the poster from the students of the director of Bait.
We've got to jump on it.
Oh, man.
You've got to jump on it.
Yeah, well, I might have to ask him. But
if you're listening. Yeah. So, moving on to our next episode.
Yes.
So, a couple of quite interesting releases coming up, or films that are currently already out. I thought it'd be interesting to go with Babylon.
Yeah, okay.
Director Damien Chazelle returning with what looks to me, anyway, from the brief trailers I've seen, a very sort of nostalgia-laden exploration of sort of the more debauched side of classic Hollywood.
Yes, interesting.
I think it will be an interesting place to start a discussion on the self-reflective nature of Hollywood.
Okay.
And we could talk about some of our favourite examples.
Yeah.
And then obviously lean into the film itself. And you wanted to talk about Damien Chazelle himself and his career, because you're quite a fan, aren't you?
Yeah, I do. I like two of his films a lot. And then there's one other one which I admire from a distance.
Okay.
But I'm a big Chazelle fan, despite the fact I've never really been that into jazz. Odd.
Yes.
But I think he's a really interesting director, and a very in terms of kind of him applying modern sensibilities to classic Hollywood tropes.
Okay.
So,
I'd agree with that.
Tune in next week for that.
Indeed. Right. Well, have a lovely week, and you'll see you in the next one.
See you in the next one. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers.